He and his old service dog just wanted to clean up the sidewalk outside his house. The neighbors laughed until the dog barked in the right spot. Under a layer of trash, the veteran found a box that had been hidden for many years. See how a routine cleanup turned into the exposure of a dangerous crime. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments which city you are from. Morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Thomas Reed's small house, brushing across the worn oak table, the coffee mug with a crack near the handle, and the faded photograph of a man in uniform beside a black German shepherd. The man in the picture still had color in his face and purpose in his eyes. Now, years later, those same eyes stared out the window, watching the street with the steady patience of someone who had spent half a lifetime learning to wait. Thomas sat quietly, his broad hands wrapped around the mug as steam rose in thin curls. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. The hum of distant engines, the bark of small dogs, the rhythmic slap of a newspaper hitting a porch. Life went on, measured, ordinary, predictable. But inside his chest, a quiet pulse of discipline never faded. Even here, in this peaceful suburb far from deserts and gunfire, he still felt the world as a soldier does, listening for danger in silence. Shadow lay stretched out by the door, her black coat glinting faintly in the morning light. Her muzzle had gone gray around the edges, but her eyes were still sharp, scanning every sound that crossed the yard. She had once been a military dog, trained to detect explosives and gunpowder. Thomas often joked that she was the better soldier of the two, never complained, never hesitated, never made a wrong call. He reached down to scratch behind her ear, feeling the coarse fur under his palm. "Morning, girl," he murmured. The dog's tail gave a faint thump on the wooden floor, but she didn't take her eyes off the window. Their mornings followed the same quiet rhythm. Coffee for him, a slow walk for both of them, and a moment of stillness at the flagpole in his front yard, where the stars and stripes caught the first breath of wind. Thomas had raised that flag every morning since the day he returned from service. It was less patriotism than habit. One small act that reminded him the world still had structure. The neighbors called him old-fashioned, sometimes even odd, but they also knew that if their fence broke or a storm tore a branch through their window, Thomas Reed would show up with a toolbox before sunrise. He didn't talk much, didn't smile easily, but people trusted him. Lately, though, one thing had begun to bother him. Across the street, beside the newly built mansion of his neighbor Richard Hayden, lay a growing pile of debris-broken bricks, concrete chunks, twisted wire, and shattered tiles, dumped there after Hayden's endless renovation project. The man had promised to hire a truck to haul it away. That was 3 months ago. Now the heap sat like an ugly scar on the edge of the sidewalk, collecting weeds and stray wrappers. Thomas hated disorder. To him, an untidy street was a small form of decay, the kind that started quietly before spreading. He had asked Hayden once, politely, if he planned to clear it. The man had laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Don't worry, Reed. It's harmless. I'll get to it." He hadn't. Instead, he bought another car and extended his fence, pretending not to see the mess right beside his property. The neighborhood adapted. People walked around it. A few teenagers joked about building a fort in it. Only Thomas couldn't ignore it. And Shadow treated it as if something lived inside. Every time they walked past the mound, her body tensed. Her ears flicked forward, her tail lowered, a deep rumble rising from her throat. At first, Thomas thought it was rats or feral cats. He even tossed a few stones at the pile once to scare them off. But the barking didn't stop. Each morning, as soon as they reached that patch of sidewalk, Shadow stopped, stared, and growled low and steady. She never behaved that way anywhere else. "Nothing there, girl," Thomas told her more than once. "Just bricks and trash." But her instincts had saved him before. He still remembered the night patrol in a ruined village overseas, the soft scratch of her paw against the dirt, her sudden stillness, and how he'd called the squad to halt. Seconds later, they found a buried mine. Shadow's silence that night had saved 5 men. Sometimes he wondered if she remembered too. The unease grew when Shadow began to act up, even at night. Twice, Thomas woke to the sound of her nails tapping the floor as she paced near the window, staring out toward Hayden's property. She growled at the dark, like something out there offended her. The second night, he stepped outside with a flashlight. The air smelled of cut grass and damp earth. The debris pile loomed under the streetlight, motionless, unremarkable. Yet the dog refused to move closer, standing on the curb, teeth bared, a soft whine escaping her throat. He tried to laugh it off. "You're seeing ghosts," he told her. But when he turned back to the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Years of training had wired him to trust his senses, and hers even more. The next morning, while trimming the hedges, he saw Hayden load several dark green crates into the back of his SUV. They weren't ordinary boxes. The color, the metal edges, the locking mechanisms, they looked like military equipment cases. Thomas knew them too well. He had handled ones just like that for years. Hayden wasn't military, at least not officially. He ran a construction company, or so he claimed. Yet lately, he had been receiving deliveries at odd hours. Unmarked trucks, short visits, no receipts. When Hayden noticed Thomas watching, he smiled too easily. "Morning, neighbor," he called out, shutting the trunk. His tone was casual, but his eyes, sharp and assessing, reminded Thomas of the men he'd once interrogated in foreign camps, the kind who smiled to hide calculation. That evening, Shadow barked again. She wouldn't stop until he went outside and stood by the pile with her. The smell of dust and rust filled the air. The dog circled the heap, nose to the ground, then froze and looked at him as if waiting for permission. Her body trembled. "All right," he said softly, lowering the flashlight. "Tomorrow, we deal with it." Sleep didn't come easily that night. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes of the past shovel scraping sand, men breathing in silence, the distant hum of engines. The war was long over, but sometimes it found small ways to return. In dreams, he saw himself digging again, the ground heavy, something hidden beneath it, something that shouldn't be there. At dawn, he rose, dressed in his old work shirt and packed gloves, a spade, and a few trash bags into a wheelbarrow. Shadow followed, tail stiff, eyes focused. When they stepped outside, the street was empty except for a jogger on the far side and a woman walking her child to school. Thomas nodded to them, and they waved politely, unaware of the decision forming in his mind. He stopped by the pile, planted the spade, and started to work. Bricks clattered, dust lifted. The air thickened with the scent of old plaster. After a few minutes, he could feel eyes on his back. Looking up, he saw a young man from 2 houses down standing on his porch, grinning. "Cleaning the city now, Reed?" he called. "That's the Army spirit." Thomas ignored him and kept digging. Another neighbor passed by with her dog, whispering something he didn't catch. He could feel their amusement, but it didn't matter. Years in uniform had taught him to work through noise. Shadow moved beside him, sniffing each pile of rubble as he shifted it aside. Her tail wagged once, then stilled. She pressed her nose to a spot near the edge of the sidewalk and began to dig furiously. Thomas frowned, wiped his forehead, and crouched beside her. Beneath the thin layer of broken brick, the soil was loose, darker than it should be. He pressed the spade into it and heard the faint ring of metal. He froze. The sound wasn't from any pipe or rod. It was the flat, heavy echo of a solid object, something buried deliberately. A strange calm washed over him, the same kind he used to feel just before a discovery in the field, when instinct took command. He cleared away more dirt with gloved hands, his breath steady. The shape of a metal lid began to appear, covered in a thin film of cement dust. Shadow's growl deepened. Thomas sat back on his heels, staring. It could have been an old toolbox, a piece of construction junk. But the symmetry of the edges, the faint weld marks, it looked more like a sealed container. He reached out, brushed away the dirt, and felt a rough texture under his fingers, something industrial. For a long moment he didn't move. The air around him seemed to narrow until he could hear only his heartbeat and the faint panting of the dog. He stood and looked toward Hayden's house. The man's car was gone. The windows reflected the morning sun, blank and silent. Thomas exhaled, leaning on the shovel. His rational mind said to leave it alone. Call the city. Let them handle it. But the soldier in him whispered differently. If something dangerous lay beneath, he needed to know before anyone else got hurt. He knelt again and tested the edges. The lid didn't budge easily. Beneath the layer of dirt, the sides were reinforced, maybe welded shut. He brushed off more soil until he could see faint markings. Numbers etched into the metal, partially obscured by rust. Military serials always had that format. His pulse quickened. "Shadow," he said quietly. The dog stood beside him, muscles tight, tail rigid. She knew this stance. It was the same one they'd taken countless times overseas. Thomas straightened, glancing once more at the street. No one was watching now. The neighbors had gone inside, bored with the sight of an old man shoveling trash. He drove the shovel into the ground again, carefully widening the hole. The sound of metal against earth echoed softly through the quiet street. By the time he stopped, sweat had soaked through his shirt and his hands ached. The object beneath was clearly some kind of chest about 2 feet wide, sealed and heavy. He sat back, breathing hard, and stared at it. For a moment, the years peeled away, and he was back in uniform under the desert sun, uncovering hidden weapons caches, wondering what kind of enemy had left them behind. He felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the morning breeze. Whatever this was, it didn't belong here. Shadow whined softly, looking from him to the buried box. Thomas put a hand on her head, the old calm returning like a tide. "We'll find out, girl," he murmured. "But not now." He rose slowly, wiped his hands, and leaned the shovel against the fence. The pile looked almost the same as before, only disturbed near its base. He covered the spot lightly with loose debris and grass, enough to conceal it from a passing glance. Then he looked again toward Hayden's house. The SUV was back now, parked by the driveway. Hayden stood by it, phone to his ear, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Thomas felt the man's gaze even from across the street. Their eyes met for just a second, and something sharp and knowing passed between them. Hayden smiled faintly, a curve that didn't reach his eyes, and turned away. That night, Thomas sat on the porch long after sunset. The air smelled faintly of dust and summer rain. Shadow lay at his feet, alert but quiet. In the distance, he could hear Hayden's gate open and close, the hum of his car leaving. A thought took root in his mind, firm and immovable. Tomorrow, he would go back to that pile knot as a neighbor tidying the street, but as a man who needed to know what was buried beneath his own silence. He reached down, resting a hand on Shadow's back. The dog's head lifted, ears pricked toward the darkness. Together they sat, the quiet between them filled with something unspoken and heavy, like the calm before a storm. The next morning began with a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the world itself were holding its breath. A thin layer of fog lay across the street, and for a moment, Thomas thought the neighborhood looked like the war-torn villages he had once known, gray, hushed, stripped of life. He stood at his window with a cup of coffee, staring at the mound of debris across the road. It looked harmless enough in the mist, just a clutter of bricks and plaster. Yet he knew better now. Something in his bones told him that beneath those layers of rubble, something waited. Shadow sat by his leg, restless. Every time he looked away from the pile, she whined quietly, as if reminding him of the promise he had made the night before. He set the mug down, put on his boots, and grabbed his gloves. When he opened the front door, the dog bounded out first, tail stiff, moving with purpose. The fog clung to her dark fur, making her look almost spectral. Thomas followed, the air cold enough to bite the inside of his lungs. As he crossed the street, he noticed how the silence deepened near the mound, how even the morning birds avoided the telephone wires above it. "Let's see what you've been trying to tell me," he murmured. The first strike of the shovel rang through the air like a gunshot. Dust rose in thin spirals, catching the pale light. He worked slowly, methodically, his movements steady and practiced. Years of field experience had taught him the value of patience when digging into the unknown. Every few minutes, he stopped to clear his throat or stretch his back, and each time he did, Shadow circled the hole, sniffing the disturbed earth, her paws twitching with tension. The first half hour yielded only debris-shattered bricks, bent nails, a crushed can. Then something caught his eye. A strip of coarse green fabric, frayed at one end, half buried under a slab of plaster. He brushed it off and felt a rough texture between his fingers. It wasn't ordinary cloth. It was thick and rubberized, the kind used in military coverings. Beneath it, faint metallic markings glimmered under the dirt. He leaned closer and saw part of a serial number. A chill crawled up his neck. He knew that pattern, the 4 digits followed by 2 letters, were standard issue for equipment crates, the same kind he'd handled for years. He sat back, staring at the ground, the morning sun now pushing through the fog and lighting the mound in gold. Somewhere, a car door slammed. He looked up to see a few neighbors watching from a distance. A couple walking their dog slowed down to whisper to each other before moving on. Another neighbor smirked openly. "Reed's digging for treasure," someone called. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't even look up. His heart beat too hard in his chest. He cleared more of the rubble. The spade struck something solid again. Metal, no doubt this time. The vibration ran through the handle and into his palms, sharp and unmistakable. He crouched and brushed the dirt away with his gloves until a dull gray corner emerged. It was a box, rectangular and smooth, big enough to fit a weapon cache. The surface bore scratches and faint weld marks, the kind of hasty sealing done to keep contents hidden rather than safe. He knelt in the dirt for several minutes, staring at it. The memories came uninvited, the sound of sand shifting over buried munitions, the cautious tapping before uncovering something that could blow at a breath. He had once been the man who knew exactly how to open such things. Now, after all these years, his hands still remembered. "Shadow," he said quietly, and the dog stopped pacing. Her body trembled with that old readiness, a soldier's instinct waiting for command. He glanced toward Hayden's house. The neighbor's car wasn't there. The driveway stood empty. Still, Thomas moved carefully. He slid the shovel under the side of the box, testing its weight. It didn't move. The soil around it had been tamped down deliberately. Someone had gone to real trouble to hide it. His throat felt dry as he set the shovel aside and reached for the crowbar he had brought from the shed. The sound of metal against metal echoed softly as he wedged it under the lid. For a moment, he hesitated. 100 possibilities crossed his mind. Ammunition, stolen goods, or nothing but junk. But the dog's steady growl urged him forward. With one firm motion, he pried the lid loose. A thick smell of oil and metal filled the air. Inside, layers of cloth and plastic wrapped around long, narrow shapes. Thomas peeled them back and froze. They were rifles, clean, polished, the kind not meant for civilian hands. Beside them, stacks of cash bound in tight bundles, the edges still crisp. He lifted one and saw markings of foreign currency mixed with US dollars. His pulse quickened as he pushed aside a folded tarp and found a folder. Photographs spilled out grainy, printed images of men in desert uniforms standing beside armored trucks. And there, unmistakably, was Richard Hayden, younger but recognizable, his arm draped casually over a crate, identical to the one in front of Thomas. The insignia on the uniforms around him were not American. Some were foreign military, others mercenaries' faces. Thomas remembered from intelligence briefings years ago. He flipped through the rest of the folder. Maps, coded notes, scanned shipping manifests. He understood now. The neighbor wasn't just a contractor. He was running something illegal. Arms dealing, perhaps smuggling. And if this cash was here, others might be hidden nearby. Thomas sat back on his heels, breathing hard, dust coating his face. For a moment, he thought of calling the police right away. But a voice in his mind, one carved by service, by loss, by the knowledge of what power could do when mishandled, told him to be cautious. If Hayden had this much money and weaponry, he probably had connections that reached far beyond their small street. He took out his old phone, wiped the screen clean, and began taking pictures. Every angle of the box, every document, every gun. His hands didn't shake. They moved with the mechanical precision of a man on assignment. When he finished, he placed everything back exactly as it had been, sealing the lid loosely so he could uncover it again if needed. The rumble of an engine broke the silence. He turned sharply to see Hayden's black SUV turning onto the street. The dog growled low in her throat. Thomas covered the exposed soil quickly, using the shovel to scatter debris over the box. By the time Hayden pulled into his driveway, the mound looked almost untouched. He pretended to fill a trash bag, his back turned. "Morning again, Reed," Hayden called, stepping out of the car. His voice was light, almost friendly. "You sure you're not starting a business? You've been digging there for hours." "Just cleaning the street," Thomas said without looking up. "Someone had to." Hayden laughed softly. "That's very civic-minded of you." He paused, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You find anything interesting under there?" Thomas's grip tightened on the shovel handle. "Nothing worth keeping." For a second, the two men looked at each other, the kind of look that meant too much. Hayden's smile stayed fixed, but his eyes narrowed slightly before he turned toward his house. "Well, keep at it. I'll send you the bill for the property improvement." He disappeared inside. Thomas let out a slow breath and leaned on the shovel. His heart was still pounding, not from fear, but from recognition. That exchange, the false ease, the veiled challenge, was the same kind of game he'd played across interrogation tables years ago. The man knew. The rest of the day crawled by. Thomas spent the afternoon in his garage, reviewing the photos he'd taken. Each image told a story of betrayal wrapped in civilian clothing. Shadow lay at his feet, her breathing steady, but every few minutes, she lifted her head toward the window and growled softly, as if the air itself carried danger. As dusk fell, he looked out and saw headlights pausing near the corner. A dark sedan sat idling, engine running, lights dimmed. No one got out. It stayed there for 10 minutes, then rolled away slowly. He stood at the window until it disappeared. That night, he stored the pictures on an old flash drive, the kind no one used anymore, and tucked it into a hidden compartment in his workbench. If something happened, He wanted the truth to outlive him. Then he sat on the porch with Shadow, watching Hayden's windows across the street. Most of them were dark, but one on the upper floor glowed faintly. He could see the silhouette of a man moving inside, pacing. "Looks like he's thinking too," Thomas whispered. Shadow pressed closer to his leg. When the clock struck midnight, the dog stiffened. Her ears pricked toward the front gate, and a soft growl rumbled in her chest. Thomas turned off the porch light and peered into the dark. For a moment he saw nothing. Then, under the faint spill of moonlight, he noticed the gate latch move slightly as if nudged. He stood still, not breathing. A shadow shifted behind the trash cans, tall and cautious. The dog barked once, sharp and deep, breaking the silence. The figure froze. Then, after a moment, it turned and slipped away into the night. The faint sound of retreating footsteps faded down the road. Thomas waited several minutes before moving. He switched the light back on and exhaled slowly. He knew then what Hayden suspected, that he had seen something he shouldn't have. The man wouldn't confront him directly. Not yet, but the warning had been sent. He went inside, locked the doors, and sat at the kitchen table. The old instincts hummed through him like a live wire. He'd seen men like Hayden before, charming on the surface, venomous underneath, the kind who thought money could bury anything, even guilt. He looked down at Shadow, who lay beside him, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You were right," he said softly. "There was something there." She wagged her tail once, almost imperceptibly. Thomas poured himself a glass of water, drank slowly, and stared out the window again. The street was quiet now, the debris pile indistinct in the darkness. He thought about how absurd it was that a forgotten patch of sidewalk could become the line between peace and chaos. Yet that was the nature of hidden things. They waited until someone brave or foolish disturbed them. He touched the phone, the photos still saved inside. Tomorrow, he decided, he would call someone he trusted, someone who could handle what he had found without letting it vanish into paperwork or corruption. He wouldn't let another secret rot under the surface of a peaceful street. As the hours stretched toward dawn, Thomas felt the weight of it settle over him, a new mission he hadn't asked for, but couldn't walk away from. In the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the steady breathing of the dog, he could almost hear the distant echo of old orders. Proceed with caution. Do not engage until certain. He turned off the light, knowing the calm outside wouldn't last much longer. Thomas barely slept that night. The images he had seen in the buried crate replayed over and over in his mind. The gleam of polished rifles, the crisp bundles of cash, the face of Richard Hayden frozen in those photographs from a past life he had tried to bury. Each time Thomas closed his eyes, he saw Hayden's calm smile and those eyes that never really smiled with him. By dawn, his decision had hardened into something like duty. He had spent a lifetime recognizing the signs of danger, and he knew now that what lay beneath that sidewalk wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was the remnant of a war that hadn't ended for men like Hayden. When the first light bled through the clouds, he rose from the kitchen table, rubbed the stiffness from his neck, and poured the last of the cold coffee down the sink. Shadow, who hadn't slept either, lifted her head and watched him silently, tail giving one slow wave. She seemed to sense the shift in him, the quiet resolve that came before an operation. Thomas pulled on his jacket, checked that the flash drive was still hidden in the workbench, and picked up his phone. There was only one person he trusted with what he'd found. Benedict Harper had served with him in Afghanistan. Back then, Harper had been a steady man with a slow temper and sharp instincts, the kind who saw things clearly when everyone else panicked. After retiring from the army, he joined the city police and worked his way up to captain. They hadn't spoken in years, but the bond between soldiers was a strange kind of permanence. It outlasted distance, time, and even silence. Thomas scrolled through his contacts until he found the number, then pressed call. It rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. "Reed? Damn, it's been years. You alive?" "Alive," Thomas said, voice low. "I found something, Ben. Something I shouldn't have." There was a pause. "How bad?" "Bad enough to wake you up." He explained everything, slowly, precisely, the way he had been trained to give reports. No drama, just the facts, the debris pile, the barking dog, the buried crate, the photographs, the weapons. Harper listened without interruption, though Thomas could hear his breathing change halfway through. When Thomas finished, Harper said, "You still have the evidence?" "I put everything back. Took photos. I can send them." "Don't," Harper said sharply. "Not yet. Come by the station later today. Or better, stay put. If that man is who you think he is, you might be under watch. I'll send someone I trust." Thomas hesitated. "I don't want patrol cars outside my house. It'll tip him off." "I wasn't planning on uniforms. Just keep the dog close and the doors locked. I'll handle the rest." After they hung up, Thomas leaned against the counter. The morning outside was quiet again, almost deceptively so. Hayden's house sat across the street, shutters drawn, the driveway empty. But the air felt different, like the stillness before artillery fire. Hours passed with slow precision. Thomas went about his morning routine to keep from thinking too much. He fixed a loose hinge on the porch door, checked the mailbox, watered the plants. Every few minutes, he caught himself glancing at the street. Around noon, he saw movement. A sleek black car pulling up near Hayden's driveway. 2 men in suits stepped out, carrying what looked like briefcases. They weren't delivery men, and their posture was wrong, too formal, too careful. Shadow's ears pricked up. She stood beside him at the window, silent but alert. The men disappeared into Hayden's house without knocking. 10 minutes later, Hayden came outside with them. He looked relaxed, even smiling as he lit a cigarette, but his hands trembled slightly. He gestured toward the street once, and all 3 glanced in Thomas's direction. Thomas stepped back from the window. By mid-afternoon, the car was gone, but the unease it left behind stayed. When Harper called again, his voice was brisk, professional, edged with tension. "You were right," he said. "We ran his name through our records. Richard Hayden served under another identity 20 years ago, worked in procurement, then disappeared during an investigation tied to missing arms shipments, officially declared dead 5 years later." "Not dead," Thomas said. "Not even close. We've had his name flagged in 3 federal inquiries, all unresolved. If he's been hiding in plain sight, that means he's not just connected, he's protected. You understand what that means, Tom? You've kicked a hornet's nest." Thomas's eyes drifted toward the mound across the street. "I've done that before. I'm sending a team tonight. Discreet, off-record. But listen to me. Don't go near that pile again. Don't talk to him. If he suspects we're coming, he'll run or worse." Thomas hung up, but the warning did little to ease him. He'd spent too many years in conflict zones to believe in clean resolutions. Men like Hayden didn't surrender. They adapted. And if Hayden had seen him digging, if he'd noticed the change in his eyes, then this wasn't over. The evening came heavy and slow. Clouds gathered above the rooftops, turning the light a bruised gray. The neighborhood settled into its routine. Children playing, dogs barking, a delivery truck rumbling past. But every normal sound felt muted, as if wrapped in cloth. Thomas sat on his porch again. Shadow stretched at his feet, both of them facing the street. Then, near sunset, the sound of engines approached. 2 unmarked cars, dark and low. They rolled quietly to a stop a few houses down. From inside, men stepped out wearing plain jackets. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, hair silver at the temples, walked toward Thomas's yard. It was Harper. He raised a hand in greeting. "Mind if we talk?" Thomas stood. "You didn't have to come yourself. I needed to see this." Harper's eyes swept the street, sharp and practiced. "You said the box was under that debris?" Thomas nodded. "Right there." Harper signaled to his team. They moved efficiently, setting up a perimeter without drawing attention. No flashing lights, no noise. Within minutes, 2 officers began clearing the rubble with gloved hands. Thomas watched, a tight knot forming in his chest. Shadow paced behind him, uneasy. When the spade struck metal, Harper crouched down, brushing off the remaining dirt. The same dull gray surface appeared, welded and scratched, just as Thomas had described. They opened it carefully, using tools instead of brute force. The lid lifted, and the air filled with that familiar smell of oil and decay. "Good God," Harper muttered. Inside, the rifles gleamed under the beam of a flashlight. He flipped through the folder of documents, his expression hardening. This is enough to put him away for a lifetime. As if summoned by the words, the front door of Hayden's house opened. The man stood in the doorway, perfectly still. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Harper's men straightened, hands on their weapons. Hayden smiled faintly, stepped back, and closed the door. "Move," Harper ordered. 2 agents ran up the driveway. The moment they reached the porch, the side gate burst open. Hayden was running toward the backyard. Thomas didn't think. Instinct took over. He shouted once to Shadow, and the dog leaped the fence with the power of her youth returned, cutting across the lawn toward the fleeing man. Hayden glanced back just as she lunged, her bark splitting the air. She didn't bite, only blocked his path, forcing him to stumble. The agents caught up within seconds, pinning him to the ground. Thomas walked slowly toward them, his pulse hammering in his ears. Hayden lay face down, breathing hard, the mask of charm stripped away. For the first time he looked ordinary, just another man cornered by his own secrets. Harper bent down, cuffed him, and said something Thomas couldn't hear. It was over quickly after that. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as the unmarked cars drove away. The mound of debris was gone, replaced by a clean patch of soil. For the first time in months, the street looked clear, almost peaceful. But Thomas knew that peace came with its own kind of weight. That night, when the reporters called, he refused to speak. Harper called once more to thank him, promising that the evidence he had uncovered had already tied Hayden to a wider network. "You did good, Tom," he said. "You might have saved lives." Thomas didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired, the kind of tired that reached into the bones. He stood on his porch long after Harper's voice faded, watching the headlights disappear down the road. The dog sat beside him, head resting against his knee. Days passed. The city trucks came, poured new asphalt, and planted a strip of flowers along the sidewalk. One morning, Thomas woke to the sound of voices outside. He opened the door to find a small crowd of neighbors gathered near the patch, setting up a wooden sign. They had written on it in black letters, "In honor of those who protect what others overlook, Thomas Reed and Shadow." He didn't say anything, just stood there with a half smile while they took pictures. Some of the same people who had laughed at him before now thanked him for his vigilance. He nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere. Recognition didn't mean much to a man who had seen how fragile safety truly was. That evening, as the sun slipped low behind the roofs, Thomas sat again in his chair, Shadow lying at his feet. The wind carried the faint scent of asphalt and new grass. Across the street, Hayden's house stood dark and empty, a hollow shell. For a long time he stared at it, remembering the calm arrogance of that man, the way he had hidden danger behind a neighborly smile. There would always be others like him, men who built their comfort on secrets buried under ordinary ground. Shadow shifted, letting out a deep sigh. Thomas reached down and ran a hand along her back. "You were right all along," he murmured. "You always are." The sky dimmed to blue, then black. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed faintly, but here the night was still. He looked at the flowers along the new sidewalk, the small patch of earth that had once hidden fear and greed, now blooming with fragile color. The war inside him eased just a little. Maybe it would never disappear completely. Some battles never did, but he had learned that vigilance didn't always need violence. Sometimes it was enough to listen when no one else did, to dig when everyone laughed, to believe a dog's instincts over the noise of the world. He leaned back in his chair, watching the first stars appear above the quiet street. Shadow's breathing slowed beside him. "Good work, girl," he whispered, "just like the old days." The wind rustled through the flowers, soft and unthreatening. For the first time in a long time, Thomas Reed felt that the world, at least on this small piece of sidewalk, was finally clean again. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to share the video and check out the next one. There's always another story waiting.